Welcome top news today.
Trump continues Obama's wars against democracy. TEHRAN. U.S. President Trump's bold support for the apartheid dictatorship of Israel against the theocraticracist nation's nonJews fits into a larger picture of the supremacist nation that America itself has increasingly become. His immediate predecessor, Barack Obama, had repeatedly referred to the United States as being the only indispensable nation, that all others are dispensable, such as when President Obama addressed America's future military leaders at West Point on the 28th of May 2014, by telling them the United States is and remains the one indispensable nation. That has been true for the century past, and it will be true for the century to come. Russia's aggression toward former Soviet states unnerves capitals in Europe, while China's economic rise and military reach worries its neighbors. From Brazil to India, rising middle classes compete with us, and governments seek a greater say in global forums. It will be your generation's task to respond to this new world. He was telling the military that America's economic competition against the BRICS nations is a key matter for America's military, and not only for America's private corporations. That U.S. taxpayers fund America's military at least partially in order to impose the wills and extend the wealth of the stockholders in America's corporations abroad, and that the countries against which America is in economic competition are dispensable, but America is and remains the one indispensable nation. This, supposedly, also authorizes America's weapons and troops to fight against countries whose governments seek a greater say in global forums. In other words, stop the growing economies from growing faster than America's. There's another name for the American government's supremacist ideology. This term is fascism. The reality, not talked about in public since America isn't a democracy, is that the United States government propagandizes against foreign governments and then perpetrates coups and/or military invasions against them, in order to impose the U.S. empire's dictatorial stooges, and then to crush whatever democracy had existed there. This U.S. fascism didn't happen only in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, and Chile in 1973, but it happens also today, long after the anti-communist excuse for it had ended in 1991. Examples will be cited here, and the silenced lessons will be drawn from them, about the actual nature of the post-1952 U.S. government, the global fascist victory that has increasingly emerged after the immediate ashes of fascism's global defeat in 1945. This far-right, imperialist or neoconservative international ideology has risen like a phoenix from those physical ashes of World War II, and has increasingly won, led by the U.S. government, against the shrinking democratic world, and now seriously threatens to bring World War III to finish it, against the now non-communist lone nation of Russia, after the U.S. and its so-called capitalist but actually and increasingly fascist NATO military alliance had won the ideological Cold War, and the Communist Soviet Union broke up and ended its Warsaw Pact military alliance in 1991, while the US secretly continued its side of the Cold War and has already brought into its anti-Russian NATO alliance virtually all of the Warsaw Pact nations, and all nations except Russia from the former Soviet Union. The grim global reality is that the US government has become the world's leading fascist nation. And people around the world, outside the U.S., already know it. When U.S. President Barack Obama came into office in 2009, one of the first international problems he had to deal with was a Honduran coup, probably, but not provably, pre-approved by the U.S. White House, that occurred on the 28th of June 2009, overthrowing the democratically elected progressive president of Honduras and replacing him with a junta who were selected by the country's dozen aristocrats or oligarchs, who practically own the country. On the 16th of October 2013, I headlined Hillary Clinton's two foreign policy catastrophes, and the main catastrophe detailed there was her having assisted those oligarchs, Honduras's aristocratic families, to keep the new dictatorship in power despite the U.S. ambassador's cable to Clinton from Honduras's capital informing her that there would be no legal way to do it. She ignored his comment, persisted at propping up the imposed regime, and Obama remained publicly silent and followed through by his actions with his Secretary of State's position, which position was to keep the oligarchs in power despite the opposition not only of the Honduran public but of almost every government in the world against the newly installed Honduran dictatorship, and the U.S. regime kept the coup regime in power and thus forced the end of Honduras's brief democracy, and promptly, and for years afterward, Honduras's murder rate and drug trafficking soared. Then, in February 2014, Obama himself perpetrated a very bloody coup in Ukraine, overthrowing the democratically elected government there and replacing it with a racist, fascist, anti-Russian regime that promptly began a years-long ethnic cleansing program to eliminate the people in the regions of Ukraine that had voted the most heavily, ranging from 75% to over 90%, for the president and legislature whom Obama had overthrown. Getting rid of these Ukrainian voters was necessary to Obama because if they still lived in Ukraine, then the Obama-installed Ukrainian regime would quickly be elected out of office, and his coup regime on Russia's doorstep would end. Donald Trump constantly criticizes both Obama and Clinton for many things, but as the U.S. president he continues the most evil policies, and he sometimes imposes far-right policies that are even worse. One of the instances of this is Honduras, where Trump continues the aristocracy's and Obama's dictatorship, even in the face of its now especially clear recent repudiation by Hondurans at the election polls. The Trump regime had actually trained the Honduran regime on how to rig the vote count in preparation for the latest Honduran national election, which occurred on November 26. However, since that election, the many public demonstrations against the official outcome by courageous Honduran Democrats, and sometimes in the face of police bullets, are making unexpectedly embarrassing the U.S. dictator's support of the Honduran regime's crackdowns against the Honduran public. Regarding the Ukrainian dictatorship that Obama had imposed, candidate Trump was anti-Obama, and on the 1st of August 2016 in Harrisonburg, PA, he said, about Crimea, "You want to have World War III to get it back." He assumed that we had Crimea, but his pro-imperialist audience went along with that aggressive, nationalistic and obviously false assumption. However, on the 2nd of February 2017, President Trump's official policy regarding this matter turned out to be exactly the same policy as Obama's, when CNN headlined, "UN Ambassador Haley hits Russia hard on Ukraine," and reported the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations offered a strong condemnation of Russia in her first appearance at the UN Security Council on Thursday, calling on Moscow to de-escalate violence in eastern Ukraine and saying that U.S. sanctions against Moscow would remain in place until it withdraws from Crimea. The United States continues to condemn and call for an immediate end to the Russian occupation of Crimea, said Nikki Haley, President Donald Trump's envoy to the world body. Crimea is a part of Ukraine. Our Crimea-related sanctions will remain in place until Russia returns control over the peninsula to Ukraine. In other words, Trump's policy is that only if Russia repudiates and rejects the 90% desire of the residents of Crimea to be Russians and not to be expelled from Crimea or else killed by the rabidly anti-Russian Obama-imposed Ukrainian dictatorship, will Trump even so much as consider ending the U.S. economic and other sanctions against Russia. This is Obama's policy, and Trump's policy. And NATO's pouring U.S. and other hostile troops and weapons near and even onto Russia's borders is likewise justified by this position. Trump likewise continues Obama's policy against Syria, which is a nation that has long been a crucial ally of Russia, though not on Russia's border as Ukraine is. Obama came into office with a secret plan to conquer Syria, and it was fully operational by 2012, when some dissidents within the U.S. intelligence community privately objected up the chain of command against Obama's then increasing reliance upon Al-Qaeda in Syria for providing the training and leadership of the US and Saudi-selected and funded moderate rebels who were America's boots on the ground to bring down Syria's government, which was and remains led by Bashar al-Assad. However, just as Viktor Yanukovych had won the presidency of Ukraine in 2010 on the promise of keeping Ukraine as a free and independent sovereign nation answerable only to Ukrainian citizens, Assad won Syria's first-ever democratic election in 2014 by promising to keep Syria as a free sovereign nation answerable only to Syrian citizens, but as one that's allied with both Russia and Iran, against the US and its pro-jihadist allies. In repeated Western-sponsored polling of Syrians, even during the Assad-Ilui and Allied invasion of Syria by tens of thousands of imported foreign jihadists who demand Sharia law for Syrians, every poll shows that well over 50% of Syrian citizens want Assad to continue leading the country. But America's dictators have different ideas. As regards Ukraine, the US Stooge regime is trying to outlaw the teaching and speaking of the Russian language there, and to encourage the takeover, by force, of Orthodox churches considered pro-Russian by Catholic and Protestant ones there. As regards Syria, the Trump administration has repeatedly indicated its intention never to end the U.S. military occupation of Syria, though this would if the U.S. military occupation of Syria were to become permanent like in Afghanistan and Iraq, entail a war in Syria between Syria's invited defender Russia versus Syria's uninvited enemy the United States occupiers there, which would quickly escalate into a nuclear war between the US and Russia. WW3. The US regime expects to W in such a war. By Eric Zooey. This commentary was first released by the Strategic Culture Foundation on December 10, 2017.